You may have heard about the recovery to practice model and are familiar with diversity, but maybe you're uncertain about how the principles of recovery connect with diversity. This video describes 5 of the 10 principles of RTP and completes the process begun in Part 1 of Recovery Principles and Diversity. As we have learned in previous videos, it is important to look at people individually in the recovery process. All individuals have their own individual paths to recovery. However, it is important to examine how one's gender identity, and race and ethnicity might impact the recovery process. In this video, we examine how they impact 5 of the 10 guiding principles of RTP. These videos are part of a series of videos describing the recovery to practice approach. They're all connected, but don't worry if you watch them out of order. Just find the topic you're interested in and keep in mind the others will still be there when you want to watch them. Hello, I'm Dr. Richard Hoefer from the University of Texas at Arlington's School of Social Work. With gratitude for the support of the Hogg Foundation for Mental Health, I'm presenting information to help you learn more about the concepts of the recovery treatment movement. The purpose of this training is to advance the goal of the Hogg Foundation Recovery to Practice Grant Program. We seek to enhance the implementation of recovery-oriented practice among social workers and other behavioral health practitioners through participation in comprehensive, discipline-specific training. This video is helpful to anyone interested in learning about improving mental health services through the recovery approach, whether you're still a student or an experienced practitioner. Here we see all 10 of the RTP principles. In this video, we look at the last 5: relationships, culture, addressing trauma, strengths and responsibilities, and respect. The first of the principles is relationships. Fostering relationships within one or more important communities is very helpful for people in recovery. The RTP approach addresses this. Many types of relationships exist in everyone's lives. These range from the intimate to the distant, yet each affects us. The way we relate in our relationships depends on many factors, including gender, age, sexual orientation, race, ethnicity, and many other factors. Men and women tend to have friendships with different emphases. Males appear to be primarily concerned with the attributes that provide them with status in the peer group, whereas females appear to be concerned with attributes that develop relationships with a few close friends. Women's relationships with family often take on the role of caregivers. Men's relationships with family more often take on the role of instrumental task completion. Women are often seen as more relational than men. Although a marital relationship is associated with life satisfaction for both men and women, women's life satisfaction appears to decline more over time compared to men's life satisfaction. A loss of a marital relationship leads to less life satisfaction for both men and women, but the decline is more predominant for men. The presence of a spouse affords a relatively greater advantage for men than for women. Relationship with Lgbtq community is critical for those who are LGBTQ and in the recovery process. As family relationships are often strained, the LGBTQ community can provide support and caring. The LGBTQ community is a safe harbor from harassment and discrimination. Relationships are also important to consider among various racial and ethnic groups. People of color often encounter unique societal challenges, such as unemployment and discrimination, that impact their self-esteem, mental health, and relationships. However, strong intimate relationships have been found to be an important protective factor for negative mental health impact. For Latinos, the family relationship is most critical to consider. The cultural norm of valuing family emphasizes trust between family members, loyalty to the family, and a general orientation to the family. Culture, that's our next principle. Understanding a person's culture is important in the recovery process. This includes understanding how the various aspects of a person's identity has impacted them. Importantly, a person's identity needs to be considered in the recovery process. Gender-specific programming is recommended in many recovery modalities. Recovery needs to include an understanding of the context and needs of women's daily lives, including the building on women's strengths, avoiding confrontational approaches, arranging for childcare needs, and having a strong female presence on staff. Additionally, the importance of relationship in women's lives needs to be consistently at the forefront of the recovery process. When we think about culture related to race and ethnicity, we have to remember that generally, people view their own culture with higher regard than other cultures with which they are less familiar. Thus, it is important to become familiar with the cultures of the people with whom you work. For example, learn about their communication styles, their norms and values, the music they listen to, and the art they appreciate. These may all be different, but they will likely have an influence on the recovery process. For those living in the LGBTQ community, their culture influences their recovery process. The LGBTQ culture has a language, values, and norms that influence their lives. For example, there is value placed on the use of gender-neutral language. There is value placed on advocacy for the needs of their community. Many promote inclusion and acceptance, emotional wellness, and a safe, friendly environment for all LGBTQ people. We have some key points for addressing trauma, which is the next principle. Addressing trauma is an important principle of the recovery process. However, addressing trauma can, and often does, look different for men and women. It can, and often does, look different for those in the LGBTQ community, and for those who are impacted by racism. Addressing trauma must consider the larger context and environment in which the individual resides. It's also important to ensure that any practices to address trauma do not inadvertently re-traumatize. Females and males of all ages experience different types of trauma at differing rates. For example, females experience more trauma stemming from sexual abuse, sexual assault, physical punishment, and psychological distress compared to males. On the other hand, males are more likely to experience trauma emanating from non-sexual assaults, accidents, illness, injury, and witnessing death or injury. While both males and females often respond to trauma with anger and disassociation, females more frequently experience depression and anxiety. Males have a stronger response when they are the victims of trauma compared to witnessing traumatic events, whereas females have similar psychological responses whether they witness or experience the trauma themselves. Males tend to find it more difficult acknowledging having experienced trauma than females. Thus, males may need encouragement to discuss their trauma and express the emotions associated with that trauma. With females, addressing trauma needs to ensure that they do not accept responsibility for the abuse or assault perpetrated against them. Females need to be empowered to voice their anger and disgust and determine what they need and want for themselves. Addressing trauma for those who identify as LGBTQ or transgendered is critical. Experiences of discrimination, violence, and lack of support or rejection by caregivers, peers, and communities place LGBTQ people at increased risk for depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, suicide-related behaviors, substance abuse, HIV, and relationship difficulties. In addressing trauma with people of color, it is important to consider the additional issue of trauma that can come from harassment, threats, and harm due to the color of their skin. Additionally, trauma can come from witnessing racial violence, discrimination from law enforcement, and other forms of institutional racism. Repeated hostile, derogatory, or negative racial messages or insults can also cause trauma and need to be addressed in working with people of color. Next, let's address the strength and responsibility principle of RTP. Focusing on the strengths of individuals, their families, and community is important in the recovery process. Similarly, focusing on the responsibility that individuals, their families, and community have in the recovery process is also important. Although there are many similarities in strengths and responsibilities by gender, gender identity, and race and ethnicity, there are also some differences. Focusing on strengths is important for both women and men. However, gender differences emerge when addressing responsibility. Generally, studies find that women demonstrate more responsibility to their family life and are more motivated to carry out filial duties than men. Some studies find that women are more socially responsible than men and express more concern and responsibility for the well-being of others in the community. But other studies do not find these gender differences. Focusing on strengths is especially important in working with those who have experienced discrimination and oppression. LGBTQ strengths to emphasize may include freedom from socially restrictive views of gender expression and sexual identity, emphasis on relationship equality and shared labor division, expansive gender roles, support from LGBTQ community, and participation in social justice movements. Many of those in the LGBTQ population feel a responsibility to support their community, especially for youth who are struggling in schools and at home, and to advocate for policy changes. For people of color who have experienced discrimination and oppression, strengths-based approaches that emphasize culturally competent services and naturally occurring community support may be most appropriate. Blacks, Hispanics, and Asians are often more likely than non-Hispanic whites to feel responsibility for the care of family members, especially older family members. The final principle of RTP is respect. Respect is clearly important for all people, regardless of gender, gender identity, or race and ethnicity. Receiving respect from others helps people feel safe. Respect is important for both men and women. It means that you accept them for who they are, even when they're different from you or you don't agree with them. Respect in relationships builds feelings of trust, safety, and well-being. Listening to another is one of the most important ways to show respect, but just speaking kindly and saying please and thank you also shows respect. For those in the LGBTQ community, one of the most important ways to show respect is by asking people their pronouns. You can't always know what someone's pronouns are by just looking at them. When someone is referred to with the wrong pronoun, it can make them feel disrespected and invalidated. Asking and correctly using someone's pronouns is one of the most basic ways to show your respect for their gender identity. For racial minorities, perceptions of respect hold a greater significance in defining their identification. It's important to learn how people from various cultures show respect differently, and it's important to not impose how you think respect should be shown from your culture. For example, in some cultures, showing respect means avoiding direct eye contact, whereas in the United States, avoiding direct eye contact is often viewed as disrespectful. Those are the 5 principles of the RTP approach that we were scheduled to look at. So here we are at the summary. In this video, we covered 5 of the 10 principles of recovery to practice: relationships, culture, addressing trauma, strengths and responsibility, and finally, respect. We've only covered these principles in a very basic and abbreviated way. We hope you are intrigued and look for fuller discussions in other materials. Research and education is constantly evolving to bring up-to-date material to anyone looking for it. We hope that you will continue to explore the ideas of RTP on your own.